Imagine standing in a room where the walls are lined with gunpowder and two people are flicking matches at each other, both claiming they are just trying to keep the place warm. That is exactly what the situation in the Middle East felt like over the weekend of June 27th and 28th, 2026. After a brief, incredibly fragile ceasefire that barely lasted a couple of weeks, the United States and Iran found themselves locked in a direct, high-stakes military exchange. The U.S. launched precision strikes on Iranian missile and drone facilities, and Iran wasted no time striking back at U.S. assets in Kuwait and Bahrain. It feels like we are watching a dangerous cycle of escalation where neither side wants a full-scale war, yet both keep stepping closer to the edge. How did we get back to this point so quickly after a ceasefire was supposedly negotiated?
It comes down to a fundamental clash of strategic objectives and deeply rooted mistrust. When you look at the motivations driving both nations, the mid-June Memorandum of Understanding was never a solid foundation. It was more like a temporary band-aid on a gaping wound. From the American perspective, the mission is clear: protect global commerce and maintain freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. When Iran targeted commercial shipping, the U.S. felt compelled to enforce its red lines. To do nothing would signal weakness. But from Tehran's viewpoint, those U.S. strikes were not a defensive measure. They were a direct violation of the ceasefire. Iran's leadership, particularly the hardline elements within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, believes that asymmetric retaliation is the only way to deter Western pressure. So, when the U.S. struck their coastal radars and drone depots, Iran felt it had to show it could strike back at American bases in the Gulf to maintain its own version of deterrence.
It is a classic security dilemma. Each side views its own actions as purely defensive, and the other side's actions as entirely aggressive. But let's look at the immediate military reality of this specific exchange. On paper, the U.S. strikes achieved their tactical objectives by degrading Iran's ability to threaten shipping. But did they actually change the strategic balance? Or did they just prove how vulnerable regional stability really is?
Tactically, the U.S. demonstrated its technological edge. By targeting drone storage and coastal radar sites, they temporarily blinded and disarmed some of Iran's immediate capabilities in the Gulf. But strategically, the impact is highly symbolic. Iran's retaliation, using drones and missiles against targets in Kuwait and Bahrain, showed that they have the reach and the will to put key U.S. allies in the direct line of fire. Even though initial reports suggest U.S. casualties were avoided, the message was sent loud and clear. If you strike us, your regional hosts will pay a price. This puts immense pressure on countries like Kuwait and Bahrain, who find themselves caught in the crossfire of a geopolitical chess match they did not ask to play.
And that pressure ripples outward instantly. We saw Hezbollah immediately reject a U.S. brokered border deal with Israel right after these strikes. It is as if the entire network of regional proxies activated in solidarity, showing how interconnected these conflicts are. You cannot touch one wire in this network without the whole security apparatus vibrating.
Exactly. And that brings us to the political and geopolitical fallout, which we can analyze through a broader lens. Politically, this exchange is a massive victory for hardliners in Tehran. Every time American bombs drop, it validates the narrative of the conservative elite who argue that the West can never be trusted. It completely undermines the position of any moderate voices in Iran who might want to advocate for diplomacy. Furthermore, it accelerates Iran's motivation to push forward with its nuclear program. If they feel conventionally outmatched by the U.S., the temptation to acquire a nuclear deterrent becomes almost irresistible.
And internationally, it opens up a massive playing field for other global powers. When the US engages in these strikes, countries like Russia and China are quick to capitalize on it. They can point to the US as an aggressive hegemon destabilizing the region, while simultaneously strengthening their own economic and strategic ties with Iran. It shifts the global diplomatic balance in a way that does not favor the West.
It absolutely does. And we cannot ignore the economic dimension of this crisis, which is perhaps the most immediate way everyday people around the world feel the impact of a conflict in the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz is essentially the jugular vein of the global energy market. Nearly 20% of the world's petroleum passes through that narrow channel. The moment missiles start flying, the global economy holds its breath.
It really is a fragile choke point. Even the mere threat of disruption causes insurance rates for cargo ships to skyrocket. Shipping companies have to decide whether to risk transit, pay exorbitant premiums, or take the incredibly long and expensive route around the southern tip of Africa. When those costs go up, they do not just disappear, they get passed down to the consumer. We are talking about immediate spikes in oil prices, potentially pushing toward $100 a barrel, which fuels global inflation and slows down economic growth in Europe and Asia.
It is a domino effect. High energy prices act as a tax on global growth. And while Iran's economy is already heavily sanctioned and has built up a level of resilience through black market workarounds, further isolation and potential new sanctions will only worsen the internal economic pressures on the Iranian public. It is a volatile mix of external conflict and internal strain.
We will dive deeper into the strategic outlook and what this means for the future of global security in just a moment. But first, let's take a quick pause to talk about what we do here. The New Sentinel is a podcast dedicated to providing in-depth discussions and deep dives into a wide array of topics, from the glitz and glamour of pop culture to the strategic intricacies of military operations. We cover it all. Each episode is thoughtfully crafted to offer listeners a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter, featuring expert interviews, detailed analysis, and engaging storytelling. Whether you're a pop culture enthusiast or someone with a keen interest in global security, the New Sentinel has something for everyone. Tune in, view, comment, subscribe, and post an inquiry to stay informed and entertained.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the economic domino effect of the US-Iran clashes. But let's look at the strategic picture now. We have this cycle where the US uses air power to enforce red lines. But air power alone has clear limitations. It can destroy a radar dish or a drone warehouse, but it cannot destroy the political will or the asymmetric capabilities of a nation committed to resisting Western influence.
That is the core of the issue. You cannot bomb an ideology, and you cannot permanently disable asymmetric warfare with conventional strikes. If the goal of the US strikes was to deter future Iranian actions, history suggests it might have the opposite effect. It often forces Iran to innovate, relying even more heavily on cyber warfare, covert sabotage, and proxy networks that are much harder to target with a fighter jet or a cruise missile.
It raises a profound question about the nature of modern deterrence. Is deterrence actually working if you have to repeatedly use force to maintain it? If you have to strike every few months to keep the peace, then what you have is not peace. It is just a series of pauses between battles. The strategic outlook here depends entirely on whether both sides can find a diplomatic off-ramp that allows them to save face. By the end of June 28th, we saw reports that both sides agreed to halt attacks and resume talks. That is a positive sign, but it is an incredibly fragile peace.
It is like living on a fault line. You know another earthquake is coming. You just don't know when or how severe it will be. The underlying tensions, Iran's regional influence, its nuclear ambitions, the presence of US forces in the Gulf, and the economic sanctions remain completely unresolved. Without addressing these systemic issues, any ceasefire is just a countdown to the next escalation.
And that is the philosophical takeaway from this entire episode. We look at these events through the lens of military strategy, economics, and geopolitics. But at its heart, it is a human problem of trust and communication. When trust is entirely eroded, every action is interpreted through the lens of worst-case assumptions. If the U.S. and Iran cannot establish a reliable channel of communication that survives the political pressures of their respective domestic audiences, they will continue to drift toward a conflict that neither side actually wants, but both sides seem powerless to avoid.
It is a sobering thought to leave our listeners with. The events of late June 2026 show us that the line between a localized skirmish and a wider regional war is incredibly thin, and we are relying on very fragile diplomatic threads to keep us from crossing it. As we watch the talks resume, we have to ask ourselves, are we witnessing the beginning of a real diplomatic breakthrough, or are we just watching the players reset the board for the next round? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Make sure to stay tuned to the New Sentinel as we continue to follow this and other global developments. Until next time, keep questioning, keep analyzing, and stay informed.